Hi, and welcome to a special on armored vehicles in North Africa around the time of Operation Torch. I'm Indy Neidell, but once again, I'm handing over this topic to our fountain of armored knowledge, the Chieftain. He's also a great dancer and he's fun at parties. Now, this is part one, and it will cover Italy and Germany. Part two, we'll look at Britain and the US and with a little bit of France, all right? Rock and roll.
Greetings all. I had said that I would return to North Africa after a while to check up on the developments of vehicles in use, and with the arrival on the scene of the US as a result of Operation Torch, this seems to be a good opportunity to revisit the theatre. As before, I'm going to go over the combatant nations, give a couple of comments on the armoured vehicles in use at this point, but because I do not expect to revisit North Africa a third time, I'm also going to touch on some vehicles which will come to North Africa over the next couple of months. As before, I'm going to kick off with Italy. For reconnaissance, the main armoured vehicle remained the quite serviceable AB-41. A related vehicle was the AS-42 Sahariana, which used many of the same AB-41 components. Somewhat inspired by the long-range desert group's Pink Panthers, these took that concept and turned the dial to 11. With a capable 4x4 chassis with comparatively huge wheels, the body being an armoured tub 17mm thick and able to take anything from a 20mm cannon to a 47mm anti-tank gun, these vehicles were fast. And with all the official stowage for 20 jerry cans worth of fuel combined with whatever additional cans the crews found space for, these things could show up anywhere for raids or deep reconnaissance and were basically the LRDG's nemesis. These showed up in Africa in August of 1942. All three Italian armoured divisions would eventually see service in North Africa, but the equipment was only marginally improved. The most significant change was the introduction of the Semavente, the self-propelled guns. They came in two major types, anti-tank and general support. The first anti-tank Semaventes were the L40/47. The L in the designation indicates the source hull, the L6 light tank. Equipped with a 47mm/32 Model 35, the gun was capable of engaging pretty much any cruiser tank frontally, though it would start to have difficulty with the infantry tanks and the American mediums. The frontal armour of 3cm wasn't going to set the world alight, but on the plus side the vehicle was quite small and hard to hit. The bigger success was the Semavente 75/18, either M40 or M41, based on the M13 or M14 medium tanks respectively. Developed by Colonel Barlese of the Artillery Corps, he tried a number of gun combinations through 1941 before concluding the best mix for getting a more capable anti-tank capability into the field, pending the eventual arrival of the new P-40 tank. The gun was a common Italian 75mm Model 1935. With a maximum elevation of only 22 degrees, the vehicle's use as indirect artillery was limited, but in the direct fire support role, the vehicle proved extremely popular, with the only major limitation being the 40-round ammunition capacity. The lower muzzle velocity was such that accuracy might be a little less than desired for an anti-tank gun, but the 75mm shaped charge was well capable of dealing with almost anything that they encountered, if they hit well. The M40s showed up in January 1942. 60 were made in total before production switched to the M41, of which they made just over 160. The M14/41 was the standard Italian tank of 1942. By the middle of the year, few of the earlier tanks remained in service. The big improvement was the addition of another 20 horsepower to the engine, but you wouldn't see much difference to look at the tank overall. It is still of riveted construction with the same 47mm gun, by this point a little bit underpowered, twin hull machine guns for the radio operator, two-man turret, and still about 3cm of armour, which by 1942 standards is really not going to cut it against a lot of the tank or anti-tank guns. There was no doubting the courage of the crews, but when they encountered their Allied opposition, their courage could not substitute for a lack of armour. Most dangerous was the Semavente 90/53. I had mentioned the Italian 90mm in the previous video. In effect, the equivalent of the German 8.8, hurling the 10kg shell at over 800 meters a second, it was just as dangerous as any Allied tank. However, by the end of the North African campaign, two self-propelled variants had shown up. One was a truck mount, the other was a Semavente, actually developed to deal with the KVs encountered by the Italians on the Eastern Front. This used the chassis and motor of the M41, though with the motor moved to the front in order to leave room for the gun at the rear. The end result was a surprisingly low and compact, if overloaded, tank destroyer with a 4-man crew. At an astonishing 17 tons, 3 more than the tank upon which it was based, also with up to 3 centimeters of armor on the hull but with an open gun shield, the vehicle topped out at about 25 kilometers an hour, much less than that of the tank. The big catch was it carried only 6 rounds of ammunition and thus required a support vehicle. Well, one of the big catches. The other was that there weren't very many of them. All in all, barely 4 dozen were made, and likely not more than 8 made it to North Africa. Most will be encountered next year in Sicily. Spoiler alert, by the way. Moving to their partner, Germany, reconnaissance formations were still generally armed the same way. The earlier SDKFZ 222 and 223 remained in production, with improvements arriving in 1942 by way of the improved KWK-38 2cm cannon and changing the MG-34s to a belt feed system. More importantly, however, all the armoured cars were now to receive a short-range radio, which was backfitted to earlier production vehicles starting in 1941. The 223, of course, retained its long-range radio with a frame antenna. Similar modifications were made to the 231 and 232 8-wheeled cars, which were still in production until 1943. The previously radioless 231s received a short-range radio, the engine got upgraded to 180 horsepower from the earlier 150, the cannon similarly replaced by a KWK-38, and the armour upgraded to 3 centimeters. These things weren't really well suited for sneaking around. The German recon companies with their large armoured cars, however, were well suited for traversing the large North African deserts. A new arrival in the armoured car world arrived in Tunisia in November 42, 18 SDKFZ 233s, converted from earlier 263 radio vehicles surplus to requirements. They were armed with the short 7.5cm gun taken from Sturmgeschützen, which had themselves been rearmed with longer 7.5cm guns. Though large vehicles, they carried only 32 rounds of ammunition, had all of 8mm of well-sloped armour. A total arc of traverse of 21 degrees, though, meant that the large vehicle would have to be aimed fairly closely to the target. They were used in platoons of 6 in the armoured recon companies. The 233 would continue in production, mainly new production as opposed to conversion, but the rest would go mainly to Russia. Speaking of Sturmgeschützen, some actually did show up. 3 Stug 3Ds landed in Libya in early 1942 with slightly improved face-hardened armour over its predecessor. A half dozen Stug 3Es were also shipped in November of 42. 2 went to the bottom of the Mediterranean, the others hung around to fight until the surrender in May 43. All retained the short 7.5/24. The major improvement for this model was a larger armoured housing for better radios. The overwhelming majority of the other 147D and 278E models made until February of 42 went to the Eastern Front. On the tank front, there was one last gasp of the Panzer II, the Ausf F and G. The F was the last of the basic Panzer IIs. It stayed in production until July 42. The main change was the switch to 3 centimeters of armour from the factory without relying on bolt-on applique. As with many German vehicles, a Truppen modification was available. As a possible sign of the times, 2Fs often could also be found with pintle mounts for an anti-aircraft machine gun by the TC's cupola. The G was something of a speed demon with the interleaved road wheels, 3 centimeters of armour, a 2 centimeter main gun, and a top speed of 65 kilometers an hour. 15th Panzer was issued a half dozen of them, but there's actually no evidence that they were either taken or not taken to Libya when the division went over. Moving to the Panzer IIIs, the upgunning program continues. Developed to make dealing with T-34s easier, the 5cm/60 KWK-39 was now a feature of late J's, L's and M's, although ammunition capacity was reduced from 99 to 84. The Panzer III design was pretty much complete at this point, the difference to the M's being a bit better affordability. In addition to the long 5cm gun, which even Grants needed to treat with some respect, there was also an up-armouring program involving Vorpanzer to those tanks which came with 3cm fronts. This was a 2cm plate, held about 10 to 14 centimeters in front of the main hull, and was designed primarily to affect tungsten cored ammunition. Quite a few Panzer IIIs had the armour on the hull. Armour on the turret was a little bit more rare. Later production Panzer IIIs were coming with 5 centimeters of frontal armour from the start, which would protect against a 37mm at medium ranges, but were a little bit more iffy against the 6-pounder and 75mm now being fielded. Still capable of hitting 40 kilometers an hour with a good ride and very easy to drive, also with large doors in the turret to open for a little bit of desert ventilation, they remained popular until more of the larger opposition started to show up. The other Panzer III variant to show up was the N model. About 450 of the short 7.5cm guns had been made available by upgunning Panzer IVs, and kinda like the armoured car, nobody wanted them to go to waste. Someone had the idea of putting them into Panzer IIIM turrets, thus making the N model, with a reduction of ammunition to 64 rounds. This proved to be stupidly popular with the troops, to the point that it was ordered to restart the 7.5cm 24 KWK production to arm the remainder of the M model production run in excess of the 450. The gun was graduated to 1200 meters for armor piercing. A shaped charge round was also available. In addition to the other uses, in Tunisia, Panzer IIIs could be found making up just over half of Schwerer Panzerabteilung 501, which we'll come back to in a bit. Next up the line, the Panzer IV. When we last visited, these were Ds and Es. By torch, however, a new generation has arrived. The Fs changed the armour from 3 centimeters on the front to 5, face hardened, with wider tracks to help spread the weight. Starting February 1942, 2cm Vorpanzer plates started being added in front of the turret and hull as well. Starting July, a number would be backfitted with the L43 cannon. In the meantime, the almost identical G model with the 7.5cm KWK-40 started being built in March of 42. This longer barreled cannon saw a change in role for the Panzer IV to go from being a support or escort tank, the Begleitwagen, to a general purpose tank with an inherent anti-tank capability, simply because the Panzer III couldn't take a bigger gun. This gun could engage anything on the battlefield at the time. A few Gs would come with 3 centimeters of applique armour, Zusatzpanzer, starting mid-1942, but they would be rare until the new year. We retained the 3-man turret crew with large access doors for escape and, it turned out, ventilation. The tank is now hitting 24 tons, and with steering and drivetrain components designed for an 18-ton tank, the stress on the vehicle is now starting to show. The 265 horsepower Maybach would theoretically get the vehicle to 42 kilometers an hour, but on average expect 20 to 25 as a combination of the basic suspension and the same engine from the B model. With a perfectly serviceable gun, electric traverse of a full rotation in 25 seconds, and enough armour to protect against a good portion of the Allied tank and anti-tank fleets, this would be a tank to respect. Not that this couldn't also be said for the next tank. Now, you will recall I had mentioned how just over half of the Schwerer Panzerabteilung 501 was Panzer IIIN. The other half was Panzer VI, Tiger. Developed with a minimum of political interference, this 54-ton monster was designed to meet a specific set of requirements, which it filled very well. Later misuse would tarnish its reputation. I'd say there's very little point in going over the details. We all know it's got an 8.8 centimeter gun which could kill anything it met, though you might be surprised as to how many rounds it would take to get a kill, and up to 11 centimeters of armour, which made it pretty tough to knock out. But not impossible, and by the end of the campaign, guns had started arriving which could deal with them. It wasn't helped that early Tigers had reliability issues and operational readiness wasn't great, some ending up actually being blown in place by their owners due to being immobilized. Getting the things across the Mediterranean was not a minor issue to begin with, and barely 30 vehicles were delivered, but they had a psychological effect far greater than their numbers. They started showing up slowly in late November 1942. First combat was in December, and just over half were still on strength, if not necessarily all working, by the end of the campaign. The Germans were still working on the basis of their tank destroyers being light, maneuverable, open-topped vehicles to see first, shoot first, and kill first. The Panzerjäger 1 was still around with 4.7, but bigger guns soon followed, just not enough of them. Just under a dozen SDKFZ 6/3s showed up in the summer of 42. They were known as Dianas. These demonstrated German shortages, as they were simply captured Soviet 76mm F-22 guns plonked on the back of an unarmoured half-track with a thin armoured box around them. The Germans didn't even bother to rechamber the things, they simply sent captured Soviet ammunition along with them. There's no doubting that they worked. A few score of the towed version were also sent over, and look up Gunther Halm. The same unit also received 2 more half-track tank destroyers, Panzer self-propelled Weiss. These were specially designed, low-profile, fully armoured half-tracks capable of lugging the 7.5cm L40.8 around at 50 km an hour. They had arrived by January of 42. Both were knocked out by June. No indication is given as to how good they were or why the idea was not taken up further. The majority tank destroyer, though, was the Marder. Using either a Panzer II or a Panzer 38T chassis, they were first built with captured Soviet 76.2mm guns, rechambered to accept German ammunition, or built with the 7.5cm Pak-40, both of which were again capable of knocking out pretty much anything they encountered. Around 130 Marders made it to Africa. Another vehicle which is surprisingly rare in North Africa, in the German inventory, is the armoured half-track. It seems that few German units had anything even vaguely approaching the establishment of half-tracks. To give an idea, 15th Division seems they never had more than maybe a score of infantry 251s at any one time. Command and radio vehicles were around, as were 1 or 2 mounting a 3.7mm pack gun. It's why you don't see so many dramatic photos of Afrika Korps soldiers leaping from their tracks, as you would find from France or Russia. One interesting variant was the 254, used as an artillery observation vehicle. Unarmoured half-tracks were less rare and used mainly for artillery and recovery purposes. As a last item, again, observing the change in German fortunes, we start to see a greater need for anti-aircraft vehicles, such as the SDKFZ 7/1 with a quad 20mm on the back, or the SDKFZ 10/4 with a single 20. Of course, like most countries, the majority of AA equipment used was actually towed.
So those were the armored vehicles of Italy and Germany in the deserts of North Africa in this period of 1942. Italy is often struggling with either vehicle armor, firepower, ammunition, or a combination of those three. But it is refreshing to see this analyzed that doesn't make Italy seem like, like a meme. It's interesting also to hear some of their successes and their strengths. This was also our first look at that fearsome beast, the Tiger. For now, the numbers are pretty low, but we will see much more of them as the regular series progresses. And join us next time where Chieftain will look at the armored vehicles of the British and the Americans and a little bit of the French, again in North Africa. And subscribe to this channel and subscribe to Chieftain's channel if you already haven't done so, but subscribe again. Log in on someone else's account and subscribe again. Set up an account for your parent. Don't do that. Just subscribe. See you next time.